It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. NYU law professor Andrew Weissman is back with us with a new book and with a new and kind of eye-popping legal issue breaking in the news. Maybe you've heard about this. President Trump and his Justice Department just established a $1.8 billion fund at the taxpayer's expense. He calls it an anti-weaponization fund. The Wall Street Journal reports it this way: the president's allies and supporters stand to receive payouts based on claims they were mistreated by the government, unquote, from the Wall Street Journal. This came from the highly unusual spectacle of President Trump suing the federal government that he runs, and then basically, you might call it striking a deal with himself. What's more, the deal includes an agreement that's now just breaking as a secondary story that the Trump-run IRS will end all pending examinations or reviews of Trump himself or of his businesses regarding tax matters. Nice deal if you can get it, right? But is this legal? Is this corruption? It certainly plays into the theme of Andrew Weissman's new book, Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. Andrew describes the book as providing a path forward to hold politicians who lie to account. Andrew Weissman is professor of practice at NYU Law School and co-host of the podcast Main Justice. He was previously a lead prosecutor in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of Trump and Russian ties in the 2016 presidential campaign. Before that, he was general counsel at the FBI, among various prominent roles in the Bureau. Again, the new book is called Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. Andrew, always good to have you on. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much. It is certainly a big news day.
And let's start on that news. Would you say I overstated it by saying Trump sued the federal government that he runs and then basically struck a $1.8 billion deal with himself on behalf of January 6th conspirators and other supporters?
Not at all. Donald Trump himself, when he brought this case for $10 billion, said that it seems quite odd because it's like he's suing himself. And he then has achieved a quote-unquote settlement, but it's collusive because he's on both sides of the equation. The federal judge who had the case actually commented on that, saying that it doesn't really seem like a case or controversy because the plaintiff is also the defendant. And so to say that you reached an agreement is, in my view, pretty tantamount to theft of public money from the public fisc by Donald Trump. The only thing that's surprising is why he didn't just pick the number 10 billion and not just almost $2 billion. But this is just taking money out of the public fisc for no good reason whatsoever. It really is not a settlement of a case.
If that's the case, why didn't the judge, who you just cited, strike the deal?
So that is a great question. In a civil case, the person who brings the case, the plaintiff, has an absolute right to withdraw the case if at any time prior to the defendant responding to the case. So the defendant here had not responded. The IRS had not responded. And so the plaintiff, it's like all of this is basically Donald Trump, and Donald Trump moved to withdraw and has an absolute right to do that. Also, the plaintiff, Donald Trump, never submitted the settlement papers to the court. So there is no court approval of these settlement papers. The judge pointed that out when she said, I have to dismiss this case. But she raised real concerns about the fact that there was no adversity here, that the plaintiff's interests and the defendant's interests were one and the same.
So the judge raised concerns but said there was no structure to disapprove the settlement. Do you understand the IRS part of this deal?
So the way I look at what happened with the IRS, and it's notable to me that the general counsel of the IRS resigned, and although he didn't give a statement about the reasons for resigning, it's palpable as to what the reason is, that this is something that is collusive. I think something that is so indicative of how to understand what's going on is the fact that the IRS, in comparable cases, fights these claims. So there are people who have brought similar claims, and the IRS makes all sorts of arguments about why you cannot sue the IRS. In this very case, the IRS's position was that it was out of time. Donald Trump had to bring his case within 2 years of the event, but he brought it well after that. So that would mean if that prevailed, and it seems like, of course, it would prevail, that the amount of money that the IRS owes Donald Trump is zero. And while I do not do math in public, zero, I know, is a lot less than $1.8 billion.
Right. But the document says no examinations or reviews of tax matters that are, quote, pending or could be pending if filed before yesterday when the deal was struck. So were Trump or his businesses being audited or reviewed by the IRS for anything that you know of? Do they officially get away with something that was currently being reviewed as possible tax evasion?
Well, that is the reporting, that there is that ongoing investigation. And from time to time, that comes up in the news. We do not know whether there would be liability that was found. We do not know what the amount would be. But the way I think about this one-page document that gives what's essentially a general release of the public's claims against Donald Trump, his family, his companies, is while the president has the power to pardon all of those people, he may even have the power to pardon himself. That only applies to criminal matters. So what this does is it's like the other shoe to drop, which is, oh, I can have that pardon power with respect to criminal cases that could be brought. Well, this is taking away civil liability. So it's really sort of ends sort of all sort of accountability, civil or criminal, in this area.
And they didn't even need the Supreme Court to do it for this. Your book is about Trump and other politicians who lie to the American public and what you would like to see done about that in your book, Liar's Kingdom, and we'll get more into it. But is there an intersection between what's in the book and this kind of deal with himself that's the headline news we're talking about?
I think there is, because one of the core concepts here that people sort of gloss over is that Donald Trump's point here is that he says that the January 6th defendants were the victims. They were the victims of weaponization by what he calls the Biden Justice Department. That is not true. It is simply not true. The people who were prosecuted in January 6th all had due process. They all had the ability to go to trial, to have defense lawyers, to make arguments, to appeal. And the people who were pardoned were either convicted by a jury or pleaded guilty, so were guilty based on their own statements. And they weren't the victims at all. And we're supposed to sort of whitewash all of that history and view what happened on January 6th before our own eyes as what the president has termed, and this is a quote, a grave national injustice. So to me, that is sort of one of the sort of core lies of this presidency. And what I write about is, aren't we entitled to something which is essentially like a truth in advertising law for political candidates and for actual politicians? And I look at what happens around the globe to see that we are really behind the curve in dealing with political lies.
So to the book explicitly and political lies, you know, Andrew, I am shocked to discover that politicians might be lying to the public. So what's new here in type or degree that inspired this book?
So I think what's new in type or degree is that we have such a fundamental core lie that is still with us, which is that there was material fraud in the 2020 election. And a huge number of people, enormous, it's over 60% of Republicans, it's a third of the voting electorate, believe that lie. And so it is true that lies by politicians and by others is something that we've had, for decades and generations. But now we're seeing it in a core way. And we also have a media environment where this is obviously not a new insight for me, is that we have these media bubbles where it's a lot harder to say, well, don't worry that the answer to the falsity that politicians put out there is just more truthful statements, because it's not clear that those truthful statements will be able to frack down into the media bubbles that everyone is listening to.
My guest is Andrew Weissman, NYU law professor. His new book is Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. Andrew, you say Trump's widely reported use of deceit has enabled the use of law enforcement and the military against the people of the United States, the unlawful deportation of immigrants, and the disregard of international rules meant to promote a civilized and peaceful world, among other things. Why do you hang all that on his deceit? I could argue that Trump is mostly more direct than other conservative politicians in just saying what a lot of people in the movement believe. We have too much immigration by people of color, who he considers a cultural threat. Law enforcement should have more power, and the United States shouldn't be constrained by international law or treaties as it's been. He just says all those things straight up. I could ask, aren't those the real issues?
I think those are real issues, but I do point out ways in which lies are used, particularly in the legal system, to justify what's going on. Let me give you an example. Mr. Abrego Garcia, somebody who was extracted from this country in violation of a court order and then summarily put in prison with, again, no judicial oversight and approval of any of this. And the president said, A, he's a terrorist. There's no evidence of that. And his acolytes said he was a terrorist. B, they said that he was part of an invasion of this country that was taking place at the behest of the Venezuelan government. Again, no evidence of an invasion. And this, by the way, you don't have to take it from me. You have all sorts of judges appointed by Republicans and Democrats, including judges appointed by Donald Trump in his first term.
But this was taken care of in court. The court found, on Abrego Garcia's side.
Yes, so in many ways, I think that sort of is a good transition, which is that one of the institutions, and an institution that I look to as a way forward for us, is the court system, because that is a place where facts and law still matter. And where if you say things that are false, so a very eminent conservative jurist said with respect to the allegation that Mr. Abrego Garcia was a terrorist and a bad guy and thus could be treated this way, the jurist said, maybe yes, maybe no. But that's why we have a court system. That's why we have hearings. And if you are correct, you will be able to prove that in court, and we will make that decision. But you don't get to do it in the court of public opinion and have that rule of the day. And so I'm very focused on how can we use that truth-seeking function and oversight of the court system to get ourselves into a place where there are stronger checks and balances than what we have now.
So what does that mean? Do you want more enforcement of existing laws? Do you want new laws to stop the kinds of political lying you write about? Some combination of both?
So let me give you an example. In England, there has been on the books for decades a law that if you tell an intentional lie, not a mistake, an intentional lie about your political adversary, that you cannot hold office. In Brazil, if you intentionally lie, as Bolsonaro, the then president, was found to have done about the election, that is a violation of your oath, and you can be precluded from holding office for a set period of time. So there are a variety of ways of dealing with this, and we can borrow from and learn from what happens overseas. We also have a number of states in the United States that also deal with this issue. I think you and I are both in New York right now, and New York
Right.
has some of the most stringent laws about if you commit any felony whatsoever, you are automatically removed from office, and that's for any public office, elected or not. And so there are a variety of different models that we can use to try and deal with what I think is a nation that is awash in lies.
So a pushback question.
Sure.
You say here, as you say in the book, that your proposals are to make sure that demagogues like Donald Trump or any politician who lies to the electorate cannot hold office in the future. You were just emphasizing that point. Critics will say you're raising major free speech issues. Politicians do lie. The opposite party, whichever it is, calls them out, and the public decides in the next election. Do you really want the government, which, let's face it, might be controlled by one party, including a Donald Trump or Trump type in any given year, to have that enforcement power?
So to be clear, the government would not be the ultimate arbiter. This would have to be again in court. So it wouldn't be the position where they could just say you're out. And it's worth noting that we have laws up one side and down the other now that criminalize and also impose civil liability for all sorts of lies. I prosecuted years ago the leaders of the Enron Corporation. They lied about the stock price of Enron and about the health of Enron internally. And because they lied about the shares of stock and their value, they were both criminally prosecuted and they were held civilly liable. Rudy Giuliani was sued successfully by Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, the Georgia election workers, for lying about them, and they got tens of millions of dollars because of defamation claims. That's another way on the civil side that we regulate free speech. It is not the case that you can say anything with impunity in this country. There are all sorts of ways that lies are regulated. If you lie to Congress, if you lie to the Department of Justice, if you lie to FBI agents, if you lie to banks, all of that is something that you're not allowed to do. And we all know if you just think about truth in advertising, you can't have a product that has false statements on it that's going to market. But yet when it comes to ballots and lying about something so fundamental as whether there was material fraud in the election, we don't do anything. We just leave that to this idea that the marketplace of ideas will somehow take care of that problem. But there are so many models, both here in the United States and abroad, where countries do figure out ways to deal with that issue to protect the health of a democracy.
Andrew Weissman is professor of practice at NYU School of Law and co-host of the podcast Main Justice. He was previously, among other things, general counsel at the FBI. Again, the new book is called Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. Andrew, thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me.